the Great Migration. African Americans, however, found new opportunities during World War I. If they didn't sign up to travel overseas and fight, the factories in the North offered tremendous labor opportunities and the chance to escape Southern oppression and poverty. The Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities had begun earlier during the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, but World War I encouraged hundreds of thousands of blacks to migrate between 1916 and 1918. Cities like New York City and Chicago, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh swelled with black immigrants and would see cultural flourishes as a result during the 1920s. Women also saw a new opportunity during the war. With millions of men at war and a dramatic decrease in immigration, factories were screaming for workers, and women answered the call. Women mined coal, built ships, worked as nurses and teachers, cooks, and on the railroads and on the docks. Their labor was so vital to our war-winning effort that President Wilson acknowledged, quote, "The services of women during the supreme crisis have been of the most signal usefulness and distinction. It is high time that part of our debt should be acknowledged." Now, while paying this debt did not mean paying women equally to men for the same work, it did mean that the 19th Amendment to the Constitution would be passed in 1920, finally giving women the right to vote and hold political office. Politics. After the excitement of the war's end had subsided, the realities of the war began to sink in. Over 125,000 Americans died in the war, and an additional 200,000 were wounded. Compared to the 10 million plus who died, this number, just over 1%, seems minuscule, but this was America's first real war in over 50 years, and no doubt many Americans didn't know exactly what kind of sacrifice victory would demand. The U.S. spent $26 billion on the effort, that's $344 billion in current dollars, and soon Americans began to feel very bitter toward the president who in 1916 promised to keep us out of the war. Americans turned their political support heavily toward the Republicans. Wilson had been crippled by a stroke in 1919 and couldn't answer his critics nor campaign for the next Democratic nomination for president. The public threw over 60% of its vote for the Republican presidential candidate Warren G. Harding. The Democrats got only 36%. Republicans picked up 7 seats in the Senate, which had once been held by Democrats, and a whopping 61 seats in the House of Representatives changed from Democrat to Republican. Republicans were able to successfully channel Americans' bitterness and sense of loss after the war into profound political victory. Wilson's 14 points, which had earned him a Nobel Peace Prize for his creation of the League of Nations, were sadly trounced in Europe and at home. While Europeans did create a somewhat modified version of the League of Nations, it was deliberately made weak enough to not allow it the power to alter or affect a strong nation's actions. Most of Wilson's 14 points got left out of the Versailles Treaty. At home, his plan for peace and the Treaty of Versailles itself were also soundly defeated. The U.S. would negotiate a separate peace treaty with Germany in 1921 and would never join the League of Nations, turning once again to the isolationism that the Democrats had abandoned under Wilson. The weakness of the Versailles Peace Treaty drafted at the Paris Peace Conference would, in turn, make World War II inevitable. It heavily punished Germany, giving that nation the entire blame for the war, as well as taxing it with a devastating $35 billion in war debt that would never be repaid, as the German economy was flattened from fighting World War I. Compounded with territorial losses to both France and Poland, many Germans would become deeply resentful and bitter toward the West for their treatment at a peace conference they weren't even allowed to attend. Also denied entrance was a delegate from the tiny French colony of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was working in Paris as a pastry chef when he was enlisted to plead for his country's independence from France. One of Wilson's 14 points was to end colonialism around the world, instead allowing these nations to self-determine their own government. Minh and Vietnam would be bitterly disappointed to learn that this provision would only apply to European nations, as the old Austria-Hungary and Ottoman empires were dissolved. Japan was also hopeful that it would see its citizens who lived in Europe and the US receive equal treatment and rights as white citizens. The Gentleman's Agreement denied Japanese immigrants many equal rights and protections that white immigrants, let alone white citizens, enjoyed. As a powerful, industrialized, imperial nation, Japan was hoping for recognition based upon its merit and achievement, not skin color. The door was slammed on their request as well, leaving that nation heavily embittered by racist laws in Europe and the US. World War I's victory left a very bittersweet taste in America's mouth. Anxious to move past the war and back into an isolated peace, Americans chose not to be forward-thinking. We chose not to assume the role as the global leader we had clearly become in order to influence and steer the rest of the world into a more cooperative role. Instead, we allowed Europe's age-old jealousies and rivalries determine the success of its own peace. Perhaps the death and devastation caused by World War I weren't bad enough to encourage the world to unite and begin working towards its preservation. Maybe it took World War II's Holocaust, 65+ million deaths, and the dawn of atomic warfare as the only things that could steer us away from the Monroe Doctrine once and for all. But in 1920, America no longer cared. The post-war years offered tremendous prosperity as our trade and industry once again skyrocketed. Technological advances began to put the radio in American homes and cars in their new driveways, and credit allowed many Americans to afford these luxuries for the first time. America wanted to forget and have fun, and the 1920s would allow our nation to do just that.
Everyone had a right to sympathize with any warring nation. But now that we are in the war, there are only two sides, and the time has come when every citizen must declare himself American or traitor. We must disappoint the Germans who have always believed that the German Americans here would risk their property, their children's future, and their own necks and take up arms for the Kaiser. The foreign minister of Germany once said to me, "Your country does not dare do anything against Germany, because we have in your country 500,000 German reservists who will rise in arms against your government if you dare to make a move against Germany." Well, I told him that that might be so, but that we had 501,000 lampposts in this country, and that was where the reservists would be hanging the day after they tried to rise. And if there are any German Americans here who are so ungrateful for all the benefits they have received that they are still for the Kaiser, there is only one thing to do with them, and that is to hog-tie them. Give them back the wooden shoes and the rags they landed in, and ship them back to the fatherland.